Right then guys, and here I am with F1 Manager 2023. I wasn't blown away by last year's game, but it got a few things right. And this year's game is, without question, better. It's just a case of how much better, and that really depends on what you liked about last year's game, what you didn't, and what you hoped they would improve. If you watched the video I made when I got a hands-on look at the preview build of F1 Manager 2023, then you'll know I was positive about a few different things, and it's worth repeating those. The racing action is much more realistic as you don't have huge trains of cars all locked together by DRS. Tyre strategy is much more important due to the stark difference in pace between the compounds and even how worn the tyres are. Running tyres with less than 30% life still brings you down to a crawl, but the pace difference between fresh tyres and ones with say 50% life left is significant, unlike in 2022, and you can tell that with how effective undercuts are. Of course, there's a lot of changes that Frontier have marketed, but really I'm less interested in what they say is a huge change than I am with what I consider to be a big change. So the visor cam, which is a nice addition, doesn't really change anything for me, and in fact I've hardly used it. You get some good side-by-side racing, but you got that in last year's game anyway, and maybe it is better, but I really don't think an improvement to it was worth bigging up as much as they did. Especially because the animations of the cars can still be really juddery and you still get some violent steering inputs. Lockups are improved as drivers can recover from them without losing anywhere near as much time as before. That's not always the case though, depending on how big the lockup was, which corner it was at, and how much traffic was around them. Yuki Tsunoda cost my AlphaTauri team a third place finish in Brazil when he locked up just before the final real corner on the final lap of the sprint race and sat there and dropped all the way down from 3rd to 18th before the game did that really annoying move of forcing a replay on you just to have an excuse to reset the car back on the circuit. The animations of the crashes can vary wildly as well, as some of them can look quite realistic. And in fact, in Charles Leclerc's case, they can look very realistic, whilst others are just silly, and then there's the ones which are just pure madness. In fairness though, those weirder ones aren't overly common. I like that there's much more variety in the spins and crashes you see, and they now come with driver radio clips, even if they don't always make sense.
A huge amount of understeer and low speed. Yeah, idiot just dive-bombed me.
You can see the newly added driver confidence system come into play when drivers make multiple mistakes in the same race. That repeated mistake quirk was in last year's game anyway, albeit in a much more repetitive and unrealistic way. But that's at the extreme low end of driver confidence. Beyond that, it isn't a feature that seems to influence a huge amount despite all the hype Frontier built up for it pre-release. Case in point, with a few laps to go in the second season's Italian Grand Prix, Tsunoda had more confidence than teammate Mick Schumacher, yet it was Schumacher with less confidence and a lower overall rating who won. Similarly, the pit crew training. The variance in pit stop times is so small as to be inconsequential, especially when there's vastly more to be gained from race strategy, driver choice, car development, powertrain component wear, and so on. Mercedes had the best pit crew in the third season and won the pit stop championship. For what that's worth, because their car was terrible, and despite having a solid driver pairing, they finished 7th in the Constructors' Championship. Tyre temperatures are new and they do make a genuine difference to how you play the game, as they add an extra impactful consideration for you as the player, particularly in changeable conditions. Importantly though, the overall racing action is still as unpredictable and genuinely exciting to watch as it was in F1 Manager 2022. Addressing the dirty air effect and the power of DRS was an absolute necessity, and that change in of itself makes the races far more true to life. Apart from the fact that drivers still sit there on the side of the track and lose huge amounts of time, and the fact there's still no retirements for mechanical failures, only crashes, My only major gripe is the issue of slow moving cars. Whether that be drivers who run intermediate tyres on a bone-dry track. And yes, that's happened. It was a stupid move by almost all of the AI that ultimately led to me securing my first 1-2 as the manager of AlphaTauri. Or more common examples such as drivers who limp back to the pits on burst tyres. And yes, that's happened multiple times since sometimes the AI attempt completely self-destructive strategies. Or even just simple lapped traffic. All of those examples of slow moving cars can hold up faster cars by a frustratingly large amount and ruin on-track battles. Where it's most infuriating is in qualifying with drivers on an out or in lap holding up those on a flying lap. It can ruin the integrity of a qualifying session and consequently the race results as well. The second season's Miami Grand Prix, Verstappen getting screwed in Q3, starting the race down in 10th, and that was enough of a help to give me and Yuki Tsunoda our first race win. I've top-loaded this review with the on-track side of the game since that's clearly what Frontier prioritise. I understand why it's easier to build up hype and get people interested with the racing side of Formula 1 than it is the off-track management side. But this is a management game and F1 Manager 2022's big downfall was everything that surrounded the racing action. Fully simulated Formula 2 and Formula 3 championships have been added, which is great on paper. I've seen not just F2 drivers but other personnel move up to fill roles in F1, which is great to see. Also, in the first season, Paul Aron won the F3 Drivers' Championship, moved up to F2 and won the Bahrain sprint race. The rest of his season was terrible, but it was really encouraging to see a Formula 3 driver get into F2 and make a splash there. The teams plainly focus purely on overall rating rather than results, and I understand why, which makes the inclusion of a simulated F2 and F3 somewhat meaningless. It's just set dressing. Jack Doohan at 80 overall got a race seat in F1, but the first F2 champion, Teo Pourchaire, is still just a reserve driver, albeit for Ferrari, but the other two F2 champions, Frederik Vesti and most recently Enzo Fittipaldi, are stuck as free agents due to them being lower rated than everyone in F1, and even Ollie Bearman, who's still in F2. Then you've got the fact that 2024's Formula 3 champion was real-life F2 driver Juan Manuel Correa. But straight after he won the championship, he disappeared from the driver roster, presumably retired. That means Correa and Nico Hülkenberg retired from motorsport at the same time, believe it or not. So already the shine of the feeder series being in the game is starting to wear off. Longer term, I still don't know if anyone who starts down in Formula 3 with a rating as low as they have could ever make it to F1. And given how many hours it still takes to do a season, it sadly doesn't really matter anyway. One major and I think glaring problem with last year's game is the fact that almost everyone in F1, regardless of age, success or job role, went up by 1 overall per year. That is no longer the case and younger drivers can shoot up in overall rating. I also like that older drivers can have their ratings decline, but I think they went a bit overboard with it. Although to be fair, the first season of my career was spent on a pre-day one version of the game which had exaggerated rating growths for younger drivers and drops for older ones. But according to the game, a year and a half from now, Fernando Alonso is going to be a noticeably worse driver than Lance Stroll. Somehow I don't see that happening in real life. I still think that the EA and Codemasters F1 games handle driver rating changes better, as it isn't so age dependent and more so on a hidden potential rating. So the likes of Ayumu Iwasa and Teo Pourchaire, who are exciting but still unproven potential future F1 talents, develop into stars, whereas less exciting prospects and more established but mediocre drivers never reach the same heights. I also think it handles the decline of older drivers much better, as it isn't so steep for long-time F1 greats like Hamilton or Alonso. Also, the EA and Codemasters F1 games have engine ratings that change from season to season, and they have a very real and noticeable impact. In F1 Manager 2023 though, at least in my experience so far, the ratings still remain constant. The other customer teams keep changing suppliers, but it seems to be random or down to their ever-changing personal preference. What F1 Manager 2023 does better than its predecessor is its in-game economy. So far, I've found as AlphaTauri team boss, you can't make a profit and invest heavily in facilities, it's one or the other, which is great. Alongside the struggles of just having cash in hand, the cost cap is tough to abide by, even early on with a back market team. And that's partly because aerodynamic parts can now wear out and need replacing. Lighter parts obviously make your car quicker but need replacing more frequently, which means more need to be manufactured during a season, and that costs money. But I dare say my strategy of making the car as light as possible, sacrificing longevity and dealing with the ongoing cost, is what made it even easier for me to develop a title winning team than in last year's game. I took backmarker AlphaTauri to 8th in the Constructors' Championship in the first season, which is already better than they're tracking at in real life, to a multiple times race winning team in the second season, and a team that finished 3rd in the Constructors' Championship in that second season with one of the lowest rated driver pairings on the grid, and Yuki Tsunoda finished 3rd in the Drivers' Championship. Had he not crashed out in Abu Dhabi, he probably would have been the runner-up. Then, in my 3rd season managing the team, I won both championships. And then there's Season 4 2026, which quite fittingly saw a major rule change. I don't know whether that's a coincidence or not, but either way. In the 2026 Bahrain Grand Prix, my guys finished over 30 seconds ahead of both Red Bulls, and lapped everyone else. And since there's no new rule changes added to the game, which itself is a disappointment, or any possibility for jeopardy, such as being locked into a multi-year engine supply deal with a supplier that becomes uncompetitive, or having to choose your own aero philosophy, maybe something like my head of aerodynamics suggesting we go down a zero pod route that Mercedes took in real life and eventually abandoned. And if I side with his suggested philosophy, maybe it works, maybe it doesn't, and if it doesn't work, then that undoes a lot, but not all, of the huge amounts of research I put in the previous season. Team switching is coming in the next update, but that isn't really a solution to the game being too easy, it's just a workaround. So, on the whole, the racing action in F1 Manager 2023 is great, and much more realistic than it was in last year's game. Fix the problems with slow moving cars and add in mechanical failures, and Frontier will have nailed it from a presentation, realism, and entertainment perspective. The real issue is at the actual management side. To F1 Manager is still an afterthought, or certainly isn't done anywhere near as well. I fear though that the sad reality is, based on their priorities to date, the trailers they put out and the influencer marketing they lean heavily on, I genuinely don't think they see the off-track side of the game as being all that important. Which is a shame, as that's the only part of the game that stops it from being brilliant. I would love to hear your thoughts and experiences with the game down in the comments, and I'll see you guys in my next video.